I'll just get the slides up.
Yeah, don't think we're recording. There we go, recording started. So this evening's presentation is titled Hierarchy of Railway Standards and Latest Developments, and I'll now pass you over to Stefano and Bridget whenever you're ready.
Right, thank you very much for the introduction. As you said, I'm Bridget Eickhoff, and with my colleague Steph, we're going to talk to you about hierarchy of railway standards and some examples of application. So next slide, Steph. So what we're going to go through is the legal framework around the railway standards, and this is Steph's part of the presentation, the UK legislation, how non-RSSB standards support that compliance, how RSSB standards can support that compliance, and then I'm going to try and apply that to a hypothetical railway project. So I shall hand over to Steph for the first part of the presentation.
Right, yeah, making a mess of this. Right, yeah, thank you, Bridget. Let's start off by talking about legislation. So what do we mean by legislation? So we mean acts of parliament. So that's primary legislation, and they normally set out high-level requirements and also provide secretaries of state with the power to make secondary legislation in the form of regulations. So an example of the relationship between an act and a regulation can be found in the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act 1974. In section 2, it requires every employer to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health, safety and welfare at work of all his employees. Now, the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999, they were made under the Health and Safety at Work Act, and they provide more specific requirements for the employer. For example, in Regulation 3 of those regulations, it requires the employer to make a suitable and sufficient assessment of the risk to the health and safety of his employees to which they are exposed whilst they are at work. Now, the Health and Safety at Work Act have several regulations made under it, and they apply to all sectors, employers in all sectors, including the railways. But there are also railway-specific regulations. The Railways and Other Guided Transport Systems Safety Regulations 2006, I'm going to call them ROGS for short. They were made under the Health and Safety at Work Act, and they are enforced by the Office of Rail and Road. The Railways Interoperability Regulations, they were actually made under the Transport Act 2000, which is why there's a dotted line there. But they are enforced by the Office of Rail and Road under the Health and Safety at Work Act. So let's talk about the two railway-specific regulations. So the safety regulations, ROGS, they contain requirements for safe operation, and they have guidance that sit alongside them. On the right-hand side, you've got the Railways Interoperability Regulations. They contain requirements for new or modified equipment. By equipment, I mean subsystems, for them to be safely integrated into the existing system, and that they are technically compatible. So there are non-RSSB standards that support these two regulations. For the interoperability regulations, we've got National Technical Specification Notices. Now, these are regulations. They are based on the EU technical specifications for interoperability, and they replicate those TSIs as they were when the UK left the EU at the end of 2020. So NTSNs, they define the technical and operational standard which must be met to satisfy essential requirements. Essential requirements fall under 6 headings. We've got safety, reliability and availability, health, environmental protection, technical compatibility and accessibility. So the ones in the red bracket, the 11 NTSNs, they support subsystems, and then you got 2 at the bottom that support conformity assessment processes. We also have British, European and international standards. Now, National Technical Specification Notices, or NTSNs, they sometimes reference European standards, or ENs. And whenever that happens, compliance with the EN is mandatory. We also have RSSB standards that reference ENs, and compliance with those are mandatory as well. Compliance can be voluntary for BS, BSENs and ISOs as a way of addressing risk. Then we have common safety methods under ROGS. They support ROGS, and the CSMs, they are the same documents that were in place before the UK left the EU. There are 5 of those CSMs. You got monitoring and risk evaluation and assessment. They apply to duty holders. And then you got 3 others at the bottom. They apply to the regulator. So the CSM for monitoring, CSM for risk assessment, they also have guidance sitting alongside them. And they concern the control and management of risk. So looking at the RSSB standards, so there are 3 documents produced by RSSB, 4, sorry. We have national operations publications, and the requirements to have those are contained in the operations NTSN. National operation publications are commonly known as the rulebook. And compliance with those are also through ROGS under the safety management system. So is in the same way that common safety methods are under ROGS. Then we have national technical rules. Compliance with those are through the interoperability regs, and also through the operator license condition. So national technical rules are published by RSSB as railway group standards. So when we talk about RGSs and NTRs, they are the same thing really. RSSB can only publish NTRs in limited circumstances. And that is to fill an open point in the NTSN, to support a UK specific case, or to maintain technical compatibility with existing assets. So we have rail industry standards, and compliance with those are through ROGS or through the license condition issued by ORR. Guidance notes are also produced by RSSB as standalone guidance documents. and they can provide advice on the application and interpretation of legislation, such as the NTSNs and common safety methods. And they also provide guidance to other standards produced by RSSB, or they also just provide guidance in relation to industry good practice. So the RISs and GNs, production of those is usually driven by industry. NTRs, or Railway Group Standards, and RISs, they both have a common structure which sets out requirements, rationale, and guidance. So the requirements is what you have to do to comply with the standard. Then there's rationale to justify the requirement, and then there's some guidance that tells you how to meet the requirement. Now, the RSSB documents are developed, revised, or withdrawn through standards committees. So there are 7 standards committees, and they all reflect the various subsystems. So what happens when there are changes to these, or when they are actually produced in the first place? What sort of processes do they all go through? So let's start with legislation. So legislation starts with an idea, and that's reviewed by the regulator and reviewed against wider government policy. Then once it's decided that there is going to be a sort of regulation or legislation developed, that's drafted, consensus is reached on the draft, then it's consulted on. Following consultation, it's revised, and then it goes through parliamentary scrutiny. If it's an act, it gains royal assent, and if it's a regulation, it's signed by the Secretary of State. Then it's published and implemented, and then some time down the line, usually 5 years, there's a post-implementation review. Common safety methods, they're likely to go through the same process as regulation. The future changes to CSMs will be decided on a case-by-case basis. British, European, and international standards, they are developed through the relevant standards body, and we have industry reps from the UK that attend the drafting committees of these standards and provide industry input. NTSNs, they go through a similar kind of process, and we're actually going through a process of changing those at the moment. The process always starts with a need to change, and usually that will be triggered by changes to the TSI. So whenever changes are made to this TSI, we will review the changes to the TSI and to see if the NTSNs need changing as well. A reason for change could also be identified in another way by anybody, really. So once RSSB receives the proposal for change, that's reviewed by the DFD against wider government policy. RSSB will set out a business case. Then it goes to the standards committee, and if there's divergence from the TSI, it will go to ISCC, Industry Standards Coordinating Committee. Then DFD will agree or not agree the update. Then it goes to the standards committee to see if it's fit for industry purposes. It's consulted on. Following consultation, there's a review. Then it goes through a process of legal and economic scrutiny at the DFT, followed by parliamentary scrutiny, and then it's signed off by the Secretary of State and published. So similar process to what we saw earlier. And then we can look at the RSSB standards, which go through a similar kind of process. And that starts with an idea. So there's a form on our website, request for help form, that's filled in, submitted to RSSB, it's evaluated. Then there's a definition of the project, decision to proceed is drafted, consensus is reached, then there's consultation, then it's reviewed following consultation, final approval, publication, and then it's implemented, and then it's reviewed after 5 years. Well, initially after 1 year, and then subsequently after 5. Should have pressed that earlier. So the process for changing RSSB standard is managed through the RSSB standards code and the standards manual. And RSSB standards, there is a mechanism for you to apply to RSSB if you want to deviate from an RSSB standard. And Bridget will say a little bit more about deviations in her piece. So yeah, there's a lot that I've covered there. The question is, how does this all fit together? Is there a hierarchy for all this? I mean, there's no official hierarchy, but if you think about the level of detail and you arrange them, you can arrange them like this in this triangle, where you have the Acts of Parliament sitting at the top, which set out high-level requirements. Then you got regulations below that, which goes into more detail. Then you got NTSMs, CSMs, and NTRs that support the regulations. You got RISs and NOPs that support those documents and BSENs, and then you got guidance at the bottom. So that's the end of my piece. Now I'm going to hand over to Bridget.
So hopefully you're now seeing Bridget's screen. So I'm going to try and talk about how some of that might apply to railway projects, or an example railway project. Get this to move. Yeah. And I'm going to ask some fundamental questions. So why do we need standards at all? The obvious thing is to manage the interfaces. And one of the earliest standards goes back to 1846, which required standard gauge. And without a standard track gauge, it would be pretty difficult to run a railway. To achieve compatibility. And I've got two examples there of the platform train interface, which I've also been working on. So we need some standards so that we can manage compatibility between different parts of the system. It also helps us to not to repeat development work. So it helps us to be cost effective, and it helps us to manage safety. And Steph has shown you how that fits into everybody's legal requirements, but it works as to enable us to use best practice, avoid a repeat of previous accidents, and avoid known errors. And I like the ISO definition of what is a standard. I think it's very useful to pick a couple of things out of that. It's a document established by consensus. Consensus is a very interesting word, and the definition that I use is the absence of sustained opposition. So consensus doesn't mean that everybody thinks it's the best possible solution. It means it's the solution that everybody can live with, and nobody's got any sustained opposition to it. An interesting concept, but very useful in the context of standards. And the second thing I want to pick out from that is the optimum degree of order. A standard doesn't mean that everybody has to do everything exactly the same way everywhere, because that simply wouldn't work. But nor does it allow chaos. So it's the optimum degree of order in a given context. So I find that's actually a very useful definition of what is a standard. And Steph's gone through a number of types of standards. I'm going to attack it from a slightly different direction. So they may be, going from the top of that triangle, imposed by an authority, international, national, network or company. They may be a recognised method of meeting a requirement, and they may be good practice. Those are not better or worse than each other, they're different types of standard. Similarly, we try to write standards which are performance or output based, but there are still a number of standards which are prescriptive or input based. We try to have standards which are based on science, so based on the analysis of the interfaces, the risks, the control measures, but we do still have quite a number that are actually just based on trying to stop things happening that we don't want to happen. So they're based on experience. They are much harder to change because you don't really know why they work. You know that they work, but you don't necessarily know why they work. And various people have responsibilities. And these are just some of the parties who may be involved. And a number of those are duty holders, and they have specific responsibilities under the acts and the regulations. Now, sometimes you can't do what the standard says. And the way that I look at it is that a deviation is a locally specific standard. It's permission to manage a risk in a different way. It is certainly not permission to ignore the standard. And there are processes for deviating, or slightly different words are used sometimes for different types of standards. But in all cases, the application will need to explain why the standard isn't appropriate, what alternative is proposed to manage the risk, and why this is equivalent in terms of managing the risk. And is this a temporary or a permanent deviation? In railway group standards and rail industry standards, because we try to write the rationale, the why about the standard requirement, that hopefully makes it more straightforward to develop alternatives, because you don't just know what the standard says, you know why it's there. So that should make it easier to look at alternatives for risk management. And it's also essential to get support from any other parties, especially if they are part of the risk management and part of the control measures. And then the standards body will consider and approve or reject the deviation application, or ask for more information, or make suggestions as how you could do it slightly differently, but they will discuss it. As Steph has already said, standards need to change. They shouldn't be fixed. And they may change because of changing technology, improved understanding, or because somebody's found an error. And you've seen the more detailed processes. TSIs are reviewed by ERA, that's in place, the European Agency for Railways. NTSNs are being reviewed by GB mirror groups supporting to the standards committees. ENs are reviewed by the relevant European groups, and the railway group standards and the RISs are reviewed at least every 5 years with industry consultation. But at any stage, if you spot an error, or if you think that there's a better way of doing something, you can always flag it. Projects can, approval bodies can, and we always look at deviations as very useful indicators of, do we need to try and change the standard? Looking particularly at the interface that I've been spending a lot of my life in the last few years on, the platform track train interface. These are some of the topics where there are standards that reply to that. And what I've tried to do is to indicate through the hierarchy where the requirements are. So taking first of all the platform height and offset, that is in the infrastructure NTSN, but there's a UKGB specific case, which refers out to the Railway Group Standards, GIRT 7020 and GIRT 7073, which is the gauging document. And more detail is in the supporting RIS. The platform width is mentioned in the PRM NTSN, but it doesn't give any of the details. It's an open point. So again, that is defined in GIRT 7020 with more detail in RIS 7016. The track and platform curvature, obviously easier to apply to a new station than to an existing one, or even to a new station on an existing line can be a challenge, is given in the infrastructure NTSN with more detail in the RIS. Platform crossfall is not actually mentioned in the NTSNs at all, so the requirements are in our own RIS. The footstep position for the rolling stock is in the PRM NTSN with more detail in our own gauging document, GMRT 2173. Gauge clearance is another area where we have a specific case in the infrastructure NTSN, so that refers out to our suite of gauging documents. And platform lighting is specified in the PRM NTSN, which calls up certain parts of the relevant ENs. So that is all horribly complicated. But fortunately, there is guidance available, and there's guidance in 7608, which is guidance on the infrastructure TSI. And yes, it is guidance on the infrastructure TSI because that's when we wrote it. It will be reviewed once we've finished reviewing the NTSN, and we will up-issue it to be guidance on the NTSN. But the technical requirements are at the moment identical, so it gives guidance on the NTSN technical requirements as well. And 8615 is application of the PRM NTSN. So for things like lighting, that's the place to look for additional information. One thing I thought was worth mentioning, because I get a lot of questions about it, is the trade-off between gauge clearance and stepping distance. And for the infrastructure side of the interface, it's relatively straightforward that for an infrastructure project, the requirement is the platform position. The stepping distance is, of course, interesting, but it's not the requirement for the infrastructure. The step position, but this is relative to a standard platform, not any actual platform, is a requirement for the rolling stock. And then managing the resulting interface, so the stepping distance at each actual platform, is a joint responsibility of the train operators and station operator. And it can always change. New rolling stock can come in, and the stepping may change during the life of the infrastructure. So from the point of view of the infrastructure project, the requirement is the platform position. And I've said this in a number of fora, positive clearance is a requirement. We don't like fouls, but normal clearances are not a requirement. Gauging engineers like normal clearances, which is absolutely fine, but only if it doesn't cause too much of an issue elsewhere. So it may be necessary to consider the use of less than normal clearances and the consequences of those in terms of in monitoring to improve stepping. And I would always encourage people to review track fixity. In certain station areas, low track fixity may not be appropriate. If you've got solid brick platform walls, for example, the ballast has got nowhere to go. So low track fixity is probably not appropriate. And Network Rail have got research going on to see if they can put a bit more science on how you decide what the track fixity is in different areas. And also, and I know it won't be you guys doing it, but you may be involved in it, consider what vehicles are actually intended to run and try not to gauge for things that probably won't ever. I have seen projects still gauging for north of London Eurostars, which is not very sensible. And be prepared to challenge the assumptions. So I'm going to look at very quickly at an example project, fairly typical. We've got an increase in passenger numbers, so the operator wants to introduce longer trains. We need longer platforms because the existing platforms will then be shorter than the trains, but nothing's ever that easy. It's an existing station. There's very little or no spare land. It's constrained by existing local roads, bridges, level crossings, houses, all sorts of stuff around the station. So what are we actually going to do? Right, what standards are relevant? I've assumed that this is not a project which requires NTSNs, so we're talking about the Railway Group standards. What areas are covered? Where can we comply? And where might we need a deviation? So I've picked up a number of requirements. The platform position, height and offset, yep, we can comply with that. Platform width, we're very short of space. This is in a cutting. We are not going to be able to meet the requirements for platform width at the extension. Platform curvature, well, we can only put the extension on the platform that we've got against the track that we've got, and it's curvy. So we are going to have a problem in meeting the requirements for platform curvature. Crossfall, we can do. Buffer stops or overrun risk, it's not a terminal station, so that's not relevant. Other issues, we can do the other things like under platform refuges and things like that. So we've got two issues, platform width and platform curvature, where we look like we're going to need a deviation. So what do we have to do? What's the thought process? So platform width first, and these are the issues that the Standards Committee would expect to see in a deviation talking about wanting a narrower platform extension on the end of an existing platform. Okay, what are the passenger numbers? Can we manage emergency detraining and evacuation? Where are the exits? Where are the passenger flows? Is everybody going to have to walk through this narrow bit of platform, or is it only the end coach where people are getting on and off the end coach that are going to be using it? What's its use? What's the line speed? How many stopping and non-stopping trains are? If there are high-speed non-stopping trains, then you may need to consider some methodology for not having people standing on that bit of platform when high-speed trains go past. If all the trains are stopping or the through speed is relatively low, that becomes less of an issue. Try and avoid obstacles on the narrow bit. Don't put up seats, signs, lamp posts, or all sorts of other things. And consider staffing, particularly at busy times, if that's relevant. Announcements, signage. And what about wheelchairs, buggies, bicycles? You certainly don't want a narrow bit of platform where someone's going to have to put up a platform ramp to get to the accessible door, for example. So there's a number of things to think about. If all of those issues can be addressed and the risk can be managed, then there's a reasonable chance that a deviation will be successful. For the second issue, platform curvature, there's also a set of issues to think about. What are the stepping distances for the different door positions? And that will depend on the trains. If there's only one type of train, so that the doors are always end doors or always 1/3, 2/3 doors or whatever, then it's easier and you can try and tailor the stopping position to optimize the stepping distance. An important issue is visibility along the train for train dispatch. Making the platform longer for longer trains may mean that actually the staffing needs to change to manage train dispatch. If one person can no longer see, particularly on the outside of the curve, can no longer see the full length of the train, that would be a case where the train, or whoever does the train dispatch, whether that's the train operator or the station operator, is going to have to do some of the mitigation measures. So clearly consultation with them is required. And do trains couple and uncouple in the platform? That is more of an issue. If there's a curvature, can it be done with the curvature, or is it an issue? So again, those are some of the things to think about, and those will have to be addressed. Something else that people sometimes forget is temporary hoardings whilst this work's being done. You may need storage space for the materials that are going to be used for the platform extension. So you may temporarily reduce the available platform width in other parts of the platform. That might interfere with the view for train dispatch or for security. And there are a range of mitigations to consider for that as well during the stage of the works. Where are the station exits? What are the passenger flows? Do we need additional signage markings? What about, can we move train stop positions for the shorter trains if there are shorter trains so that they're not stopping in the restricted area? Do we need to worry about lighting? Will there be shadows that there weren't before, etc.? And do we need to worry about additional staff? So again, even if it's a temporary reduction in platform width below the standard, it will need a deviation. So that's what we hope we've covered. And I think between us, hopefully, we might now be able to try and answer questions. I'll stop sharing.
Thanks, Bridget and Stefano. Yeah, there's no questions on the chat at the moment, so if anyone would like to add any there, or I think we could even just, you could probably unmute yourself and just ask questions directly if they prefer. We can do that.
Somebody likes your graphics, Steph.
Yeah.
I've got a question I could ask.
Yeah.
What's the panel's views on the way that consultancies in particular are dealing with risk management? I've got a relative, a niece of mine, who works with Malt McDonald up here in Scotland, and they have obviously a specific department that deals with risk management and all the great things that you touched on there. Just wondered, to gauge your thoughts on what perhaps, is that the best way to go? Sort of hand it to consultancies to deal with risk, industry professionals, or a mixture of both? What's your thoughts?
You want to pick that one up first, Steph?
Well, yeah, that's
I'll give it a go if you want.
Tricky question, but I would say that it would be up to, it would be up to the person that engaging the consultant to decide, if they're going to have them do risk manage on their behalf. But that doesn't actually absolve them of the responsibility for managing risks. So, so it's entirely up to them how they want to manage risks and who they want to do it on their behalf. Did you want to add anything to that, Bridget?
I would say the same thing in slightly different words. The duty holder carries the risk.
Yeah.
And they will have to take the mitigating measures. They can get other people, consultants, whoever, to help them understand the risk, to help them analyse it, and can potentially be part of the solution. But as Steph says, they can't pass on the responsibility. The responsibility sits clearly legally with the duty holder. But it may well be useful to get experts involved who do this more often than the poke on the ground do, to analyse it, look at the risks, look at the mitigations, point up the areas of major concern, but the responsibility in the end sits with the duty holder.
Thanks for that. Joan, you've got your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, please. Thank you. Thanks, Bridget and Steph, for a very interesting presentation. So I'm not really sure if this is a silly question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So with the change in relationship with Europe in terms of Brexit, does that change anything in terms of the hierarchy or compliance with legislation?
No. No. Everything that was in place before Brexit is still in place now. So the whole sort of relationship between all the different standards and legislation is still the same as it was before.
Right. And that will be the way going forward, will it?
Well, I can't say much about what's going to happen in the future. But as far as I know, in the immediate term, things are going to be the same as they have been. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Steph. And then I've got a second follow-up question.
I can add a
Oh,
bit
yeah,
to
sorry,
that if
Bridget.
you-
Yes,
if
yeah.
you want, Joan, because I'm actually leading the mirror group that's reviewing the infrastructure NTSN at the moment. So for those who are familiar with the TSIs in the old world, the technical requirements in the NTSNs are still currently identical. There was a lot of work behind the scenes to make the legal text point to the legal documents that Steph's been talking about rather than the EU directives, because clearly those no longer apply to us, but the technical requirements are unchanged.
Right.
We may, in some areas, decide to start doing something a little bit different. And that was the process that Steph showed you, which needs to go through the DFT review and so on. So we've got an industry mirror group. If anybody else wants to join us, let us know. Looking at the changes that are being proposed to the TSI, and we've already done a brief industry consultation on the NTSNs to say, is there anything that anybody has identified that needs to be changed? Now we've got this opportunity. Nothing significant came up in that, but there may be some areas where we think we can do something a little bit different from our former European partners.
Okay.
We don't know that there will be, but that opportunity is there.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And then I do have a second question, which I think is probably for you, Bridget. In your example there, you were showing, you know, platform width situation and platform curvature situations, which no doubt multiple projects have to deal with quite regularly. But in my experience, it always seems that when you're in a project and you're dealing with that, it feels like we're the first team that have ever come across this, and we go through all this rigmarole to try and understand what to do. So do you think there is enough guidance out there to really help projects to understand, look, 25 people have done this before you, here's a set of rules you could follow and apply to your project, and not take so long to get to a solution which is suitable for your situation?
Yeah, there's a number of things that we're trying to do. The solutions will always be location specific because the risks are location specific.
Yes.
But to help, the deviations register, which is an Excel sheet, which is on the RSSB website, gives you access to the bones of every deviation that's been granted. So if you go and look at that and search for the clause that you want to deviate against, you don't get all the gory details, but you get quite a lot of information on what other people have already done. And you also find out who's already done it. And there might be some of your friends in there that you can go and talk to.
Exactly, phone a friend.
So that's the first thing. You can see who's already done it. The second thing is that my colleagues now run deviation workshops.
Right.
So you can contact RSSB and say, I think I need to deviate to this. I've got the beginnings of my thoughts. Can I come and talk to you? And come as in it'll be virtual. You don't need to physically turn up at the Helicon, but you can if it's convenient. And they will happily look through what you're proposing and talk you through what other people have done, what you might have missed. So you don't have to put it into the standards committee and get a rough ride. You can talk it through in advance.
Right, brilliant. Okay, thank you very much. That's very comprehensive. Thank you. Thanks, Angus.
That was really interesting to note that the deviation workshop might see me involved in that at some point in the future.
It's not me. It's my it's largely my colleague Dominic Truman, who would be leading on that on behalf of Anna, who now chairs the standards committee.
Yeah.
And you can always ask us for advice. We're here to help, honest.
Yeah, I think there is an element there, Bridget, isn't there, where people maybe are a bit scared to ask because maybe they don't want to hear the answer that they're going to get.
Well, putting it off doesn't help generally.
No, I know.
Can you seek a deviation from standard from quality of the work that was produced after the job? If there was poor quality outcome, and then there's it's not to standard.
We have had, after the event, deviations. They don't go down very well, which won't surprise you. And people will, the committee will expect you to have thought about what can you do to improve it. So, for example, I'm afraid somebody's put these coper stones at the wrong place, so that they're the wrong offset from the track. Okay, when's the next opportunity to do a design line on the track and get the track back in the right place relative to your new copers, for example, if juggling the copers isn't going to work? So there will be okay, that's where you are. Somebody's management of the installation didn't quite go to plan. What are you going to do about it, rather than, oh bother, we'll have to live with it?
Ron Dempster, you've got your hand up. You want to ask a question?
Hi there. I was wondering what the limitation of the network or railway system is in relation to RSSB specifications.
Well, RSSB standards cover the GB mainline railway. Now, when we say GB mainline railway, that does not include High Speed 1 or the Channel Tunnel or Northern Ireland. So it's everything apart from those networks. And it obviously doesn't include metros and trams or anything like that. Does that answer your question?
Or sidings?
Some sidings are within scope of RSSB's documents if it's part of the mainline railway. So you do get some sidings that are, yeah. Yeah,
and there are also in some of the standards you'll find requirements that I know, because we just reviewed the buffer stops, for example, and somebody pointed out to us that you could have an incident in a siding which then affected a running line. So things like buffer stops in sidings, if an overrun would affect a running line, is more obviously in scope of the standard than something which would be contained within the siding.
But privately owned sidings away from the main line are not within scope.
No, privately owned networks are not within scope, no.
Privately owned railways, never mind the sidings. So if British Steel have got, as they have, railways on some of their sites, they can manage those in their own way, and other industrial centres as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
That doesn't mean that the standards are not useful guidance. Even if they don't apply, they may well, they don't legally apply, they may well be useful things to refer to and change from them with good reason, rather than just because you can.
I'm in complete agreement, and for context, I have a large portfolio of similar to British Steel sidings, so that's why I'm asking the question. So thank you very much.
Yeah, the standards will give you a good idea of what the risks are that they would wish to manage, and there may well indeed be different ways of managing them, but the risks won't be any different.
Yeah, I see a few people with their hands up. I'm going to go to Jim Watson in the room for the next question.
Yeah, I think one for Bridget. What kind of degree of integration takes place between the various national technical specifications? I'm thinking in particular infrastructure, PRM and rolling stock, having noticed recently the appearance of multiple gantries cluttering up station platforms, carrying, in the case of Haymarket in Edinburgh, up to 5 different ramps for access onto the trains, different ramps for different type units, and seeing as many as 5 in a station like Haymarket kind of suggests to me that something a little adrift.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And it comes back to the areas where we are and are not permitted to have standards. So the PRM NTSN says if the stepping distance is more than this, that and the other, you have to have a means of getting somebody on and off the train. It's not within the scope of RSSB standards to say what that ramp should look like, but there is another document which is produced, well, overseen by RDG or whatever. Sorry, they've changed their name again, haven't they? The train operators, which they call the key train requirements, which is also available on the RSSB website, and it's currently going through revision, which gives good practice in a lot of these areas for rolling stock where we don't have standards because they're not within scope of standards. And ramps is one that is very definitely mentioned in that. So anybody specifying rolling stock would be well advised to read that document very carefully. It's a long document, but it's got a lot of really useful stuff in it to avoid people have fallen down those holes. But in terms of your question about interfaces between the NTSNs, that is fairly robust because we do talk to each other in RSSB. So I'm involved in both the PRM and the infrastructure, and I talk to the colleagues who are involved in the rolling stock documents. So we do try and make sure that we manage the interfaces within the scope that the standards are allowed to cover.
Thank you, Bridget.
Okay, Angus, you have a question?
Well, there's 2 points of query. I suppose one at the end of that, just in the hierarchy of law to standards, if there wasn't a pre-existing standard in a private railway and someone chose to ignore the RSSB standard and it was a point of law, then they'd be asked to justify why they ignored it. And then the other one, just to query Steph, in the instance of Nexus infrastructure, where they're going from metro onto mainline, have they adopted RSSB standards throughout their system? Because I think they have.
I mean, I don't know if they have adopted RSSB standards, but if they're not legally required to adopt them, they're perfectly welcome to adopt them. Just because they're a metro and they fall outside the scope of RSSB standards doesn't mean that they doesn't mean that they can't apply them.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So, and did I answer your other question? Was it 2 questions?
So, well, sorry. Well, the other one was, sorry, because in Nexus's circumstance, the metro trains run on the main line. So when they run on the main line, they would have to comply with RSSB standards on the main line.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah.
In most cases they do. I do know that, for example, the Tyne and Wear trains. Yeah. I'm not sure about the new ones, but the current trains certainly don't meet the mainline crashworthiness standards. Right. So the risk of but running into something and damaging yourself is managed operationally. So they have permission to run on the main line without meeting all of the crashworthiness standards that they would have to do if they were mainline vehicles. But I think they probably meet virtually everything else. But that risk is managed in a different way. It's not ignored. Yeah.
Okay. So it's like signal protection or something. Not
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. That was me.
It's similar to what we do with heritage vehicles that run on the mainline railway, because even though they are excluded from the mainline railway requirements in ROGS, when they do run on the mainline railway, there are certain things that they have to comply with. So we have certain standards that they have to meet in order to do that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Russell, I'm not putting you on the spot, but I thought in your line of work you might have had something to say. But
actually, absolutely, I did, yeah. And Joan stole my question, actually, and then Bridget answered another one I had. Yeah, so I'm kind of running out of questions. So, but I suppose one thing one thing I always felt that after the exit of EU and the move towards the NTSNs, I thought that was always the opportunity, I suppose, to try and make it more GB specific and simplify the document, you know. So I suppose, is that still the intention, I suppose, for regards to, you know, like open points or specific cases of that, so that there would be one, because it is now covering just, you know, GB, I suppose. So is that the direction that, you know, that you would like to go, or any feelings on that?
Well, for the time being, because the NTSNs, they're actually published by the Secretary of State, so it's the government's document. And for the time being, they want us to align with the TSIs. So you know, so if we make any changes to NTSNs, we need to stick as closely as possible to the TSI and the way it's worded, because we don't want to get in this position where if you know, if somebody is trading in Europe as well as the UK, and they want to see what the similarities are, we need to make it easier for them to see the similarities between the two documents. So we need to sort of maintain some sort of uniformity in terms of the way the both documents look. But having said that, Brexit does provide an opportunity for us to do things differently. So, you know, as Bridget mentioned earlier, if we do that, we can then have specific cases in the UK, which are different from the main sort of TSI NTSN text. So anybody that's trading in both the EU and the UK, they can still see how the NTSN is similar to the TSI.
Yeah, thank you.
That's important for us buying stuff as a customer. We don't want to make it more expensive to trade with us because people are unfamiliar with the documents, and many of our suppliers are international. But equally, it works for GB-based companies who want to sell into the rest of Europe as well. So they can be pretty sure that something that complies with one of the documents will also comply with the other, and they don't have to go through a lot of different hoops to be able to trade.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. I think that often some of the sort of frustrated projects sometimes miss, because we always get this kind of, well, we're never going to run the Eurostar up in Thurso at the north of Scotland, are we? And it's not necessarily just about that. That's one aspect, I suppose, but that kind of trade and allowing different suppliers and contractors to work in different ways, but using the same tools and equipment and processes, you know, that type of thing is really important. And sometimes I think that's missed about one of the drivers for that, which has helped quite dramatically. But yeah, I mean, I think the industry is still having this week's shortage is CIS screens for stations. You just can't buy them no matter how much money you have, you know what I mean? So, but yeah, it gives a much wider gene pool, doesn't it, to reach out, you know, to try and use different materials and that. But excellent. Thank you very much for a brilliant presentation. Really kind of informative and practical, you know, and I think that's what everybody needs, that kind of practical element as well, how to apply it. So thank you.
Any further questions from anyone at all before we close out?
Can I just ask the Steve Muirhead, Regional Asset Manager, Signalling, retired. Can I just ask the speakers to comment on the example that you talked about, which was platform extensions. And recently, platform extensions become so damn difficult that the default is SDO.
That may be the right answer. It may not be the right answer. I live just outside Nottingham, and all the long trains that stop at my platform, it takes six vehicles and 10-car trains regularly stop. So SDO is used there at least once an hour on each platform in both directions. So SDO is not in itself a problem, but it may not be the right answer. It's an answer. Is it difficult because people are worried about not being able to comply with the standards? Or is it difficult because getting possessions is a nightmare?
I suspect all of the above.
Okay, because if it's getting possessions is a nightmare, then that is the real world, isn't it? And maybe actually trying to pour more concrete is not the right answer. And it depends on the passenger numbers and all of those things, whether a longer platform is actually the right answer or SDO is the right answer.
Plus the fact, of course, the SDO is on the train, plus the bleeds. So it's relatively simple to implement.
That's another example of dumping the risk mitigation on somebody else. And it's easy for the station operator to say that. It's less easy for the on-train staff when somebody's in the wrong bit of the train and gets overcarried because they didn't get through the train fast enough to the door they could get out of. So all of those things need to be taken into account.
Okay, if we've no more questions, I'll just move on to the vote of thanks. I should point out as well, it's on our camera, we're looking at you on the screen to my left, but our camera's on the right, so it's a bit disorientating and we're probably looking in the totally wrong place when we're speaking to you, but that's our explanation. So I'd just like to say thanks very much for the excellent presentation. You know, standards are the foundation of everything we do in the railway. I think it's easy to become overwhelmed by them at times, and I think your presentation was most welcome in guiding us through that world. Your opening slides were excellent, showing us the relationship between the different types of standards and the guidance notes, and the two main railway specific groups and the subdivisions of the groups that go with them as well. And I think once again, the beauty of recording these presentations on Teams is that people can go back and watch again. And I think those slides will be very much watched again and screenshotted and used, so really useful. Yeah, it's the circular process you went through as well that shows how standards change is you know, it just goes to show the work involved and the steps involved in that, and as it should be, but it's quite a long chain of events to get to a change. That was good to see that. And the hierarchy of standards pyramids, again, as Angus commented on, that was really useful. And again, people I'm sure will be stealing that for use elsewhere. Again, Bridget, I really liked your description of what a standard is and the phrase you had about consensus being the absence of sustained opposition. I think, you know, can use that in a lot of forms, walks in life, and as a line manager, I think I'm going to use that on my team quite a lot in a lot of situations. And you also covered the deviations and the need for standards to change as technology evolves and we gain better understanding of an area. And a few of us on the call are involved in track renewal, so the platform track and train interface you discussed is a regular challenge that comes up time and time again. And with the introduction more frequently now of new fleets, those standards I'm sure will be poured over. Really good advice you gave on that front, on the clarity and what the main requirements are, such as step position and positive clearance. And the typical example you worked through was again really helpful. I'm sure there are many different approaches you could have taken to the presentation tonight, and it's a vast topic. I'm sure you could have went into a lot more depth in each area, but I think you framed it just right. So if I could just ask everyone to join with me and thank our speakers for this evening. Could you give us a brief reminder again on our next meeting for everyone before they leave? Or not?
Well, it's the 17th of November, but the speakers to be confirmed. So it's the third Wednesday. We will have a presenter, but the NR61 is not happening, unfortunately. So I'll send invite to each of our members once we know the detail, and we'll also post details on social media. So keep a lookout for those. Thank you all for attending, and great to see you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.